All right, we're back. It's been a while since JM and I got together. We talked about the week 1 slate last Wednesday, I believe is when that released, and we have a ton more information to sift through now. We are going to look at the week 2 GPP slate from all the angles, what we learned, how we can continue to think differently from the field and move our way up the leaderboards. Let's do it.
I suffer from a debilitating condition known as atrophic shockeitis.
Peter's one of the greatest depositors I've ever seen.
Trust the process. Let's go. Let's go.
I got auto matched with Levitan. This is bullshit.
If I just go the other way in that 66, I win all the money. All the money.
If I had 150 lineups, I'd win too.
Process over results.
Make a bitch go crazy. I don't know which one of these my baby. Bust out AP, 35 bullets in your head like KD. Bust it, bitch go bust it. And I had 10 pints with me in Russia.
Hey everyone.
All right, JM. Last week we had suit, very business like JMToWin. This week we have parka, JMToWin. What's going on? Is it cold out there or what?
Oh, it's better than parka. It's actually a full body sleeping bag that it's got a hood and everything. So the people voted for, here's the thing, the people voted for Blazer every week, but the OWS fam is really protective of the site, and they've kind of worked for years to make sure nobody else knows about it. So now that I'm on your show where people are going to know about the site, I want to make sure that they take me as non-seriously as possible. Maybe they won't check out the site. We'll be able to keep it protected for the users. I don't think this sleeping bag is going to stay on me for long. Same as last week. I might actually have to step off camera to even take the whole thing off. But yeah, don't be distracted if I disappear for a moment and come back with just a normal shirt on. But I've got my sleeping bag on for the first couple minutes. We're ready to kick back, get cozy, and talk some NFL.
I love it. I'll see how long this bit lasts compared to your Blazer bit, because you bailed on that one quickly. And I have a feeling you're going to overheat here fast.
Yeah, no, this is not a long-term thing.
Beautiful. Yeah, it is funny getting the comments. I got a lot of those comments too in the comment section in the Discord. Hey, stop. I enjoyed the show, but you need to shut down this operation immediately. There's a lot of people who are worried about the 1 week season and JMToWin and all the good stuff getting out of there. But that's just what we're going to do here.
Yeah. Sorry, OWS fam. I mean, we've done our best for years to keep us a secret, but I've got a sleeping bag. I've got the Blazers. We'll see what else we pull out throughout the season that might chase some people off.
And I will also say there's lots of places to get your fill on 1 week season. Obviously, oneweekseason.com. Also, JM is writing for us in the Fantasy Life newsletter. We have a couple 1 week segments there. That's a free newsletter every week. If you guys can't get enough of this stuff, we had a really good feature in today's looking at value across sites, kind of finding arbitrage of, hey, this is the guy you want to play on DraftKings versus FanDuel based on pricing there. So you can keep an eye out for a weekly piece from JM, a value report from 1 week season every single week in the newsletter. But JM, I want to check in on how your week 1 went, how you're feeling about the season. It was definitely not our kind of week in week 1. I'll say that.
No, it was, it's not like all the chalk hit, and it's not like all of our preconceived notions were proven accurate, but a large enough chunk of the chalk hit that if you looked at first place rosters in a lot of tournaments, it was 15% ownership, 26% ownership, 18% ownership, 17% ownership, top to bottom across these rosters. And that's totally fine. We have to understand that there are going to be weeks like that. I had 3 rosters in play. I had 2 with Mahomes, 1 with Herbert. The ones with Mahomes weren't my favorite rosters that I've ever built from like a holistic standpoint, strategy and leverage and all that stuff. They actually both bubbled. So those were my better rosters in terms of production. My favorite roster, my main roster, was the Herbert roster. And it was a Herbert plus, what pass catcher did I use? Herbert plus Eckler plus Josh Jacobs. And you basically say, if this game is extremely high scoring, which we had a couple of these last year, Herbert plus Eckler get all the points. There were a couple times last year where they combined for over 5x their week 1 salary. And that was their 47-42 game, their 41-37 game. So the thought was, nobody wants to play Josh Jacobs because they don't know what his role is. They think he's not going to catch passes. And people tend to think in this binary one track mindset where it's like, okay, high scoring game, we want pass catchers. But really high scoring game, you're just saying who scores all the touchdowns. And so I wanted to get out ahead of that Josh Jacobs play. I knew that if I put him on that build, it was this expensive block of players that was essentially 0% owned in any tournament I was in. So from there, I could play favorite plays, because if that hit for one of the Chargers blow up games, I'm getting so many more points than everybody else is getting for that salary, and they're different points than everybody else is getting. This week, it looks like Josh Jacobs is starting to gain a little bit of steam. So it would be just like DFS for him to hit this week, the week after I was on him at 1% ownership in a block that was 0% owned. But yeah, I really liked that roster last week. It had Dotson and Kirk on it, had Elijah Moore and Mark Andrews, and it just didn't come together because of the block not hitting. But that was one of my favorite rosters I built, just from a standpoint of what gives me my best path to first place. Didn't work out, but we turned the page to week 2. What about you, Pete? Did you do all right in week 1?
No, I didn't do well. I had, the Mike Williams cover boy. I was kind of on those Charger stacks as well. So that didn't work out. And I faded a lot of the chalk. I made that Jonathan Taylor pivot off of the Pittman and the CMC stuff. So that worked out well. But it was a week where if you didn't have at least 2 to 3 of those really good chalk pieces, you were dudzo. I do remember for Tilt Space, we played a lineup in the Game Changer, the $1,500 one. That lineup didn't do well, but I was tabbing through it. I saw your Justin Herbert, Josh Jacobs, and I was like, this sneaky guy, JM here. And you were sharp, of course, on that Jacobs thing, because there was so much uncertainty. And then lo and behold, Zamir White, a guy who had gotten talked up a lot in the preseason, basically had no role. Amir Abdullah not playing basically at all. And you just had a 2-man backfield with Bolden and Jacobs, and he can definitely, smash expectations when it's just those 2 guys.
Yeah, and if we think about, again, this is kind of big picture stuff, right? So don't necessarily apply this directly to this week and say, oh, who are they talking about right here? But just from a standpoint of how to build rosters, if we are building for a particular game environment, we want to complete that bet. And so if you put something like Herbert and Eckler on a roster, you think about how much they cost together. You are betting on that game environment where they score 35 plus points, where the offense scores 5 plus touchdowns. And that's probably a game environment where the opposing team is scoring 4 touchdowns. And so it's mostly about getting the overlooked touchdowns that can come. Jacobs went out and got a carry at like the 4-yard line on the Raiders' first or second drive. Had a cutback lane to the end zone, made the cut. His feet fell out from under him, and he kind of got phased out a little bit from there. So if he'd scored the touchdown, the story might have been a little bit different, but it is what it is. Yeah, and again, that's what we talk about with process over results when we talk about building rosters for first place and understanding what we mean by that, what we're doing there. Because a roster, like I was disappointed about my Mahomes rosters, which performed better, but I was disappointed because they just never clicked for me as great rosters. The Herbert one, as soon as I built it on like Wednesday last week, it was like, whatever happens with this roster, this is a roster that would make money over time, and you feel great about that. So yeah, that was the week 1 game changer. We'll see what happens week 2.
Yeah, and did you have any other, every year it does seem like the DFS landscape's evolving. We touched on this a little bit last week. Was there anything surprising to you, field trends, anything where you did feel a shift, or does this feel like business as usual relative to, say, last year?
I wouldn't say business as usual, but I'd say it's a little too early to make a call there. And I think that one of the things we always want to be out in front of is the changes in the NFL, because teams are always adapting and adjusting to how they use players, how they deploy players. And so a few years ago, it was idiotic to pay up at running back on DraftKings because it's a PPR site, and the pay up running backs were guys like Adrian Peterson who never caught passes. So you were just always relying on touchdowns and big plays. And if they didn't get them, they crushed your roster. And then all of a sudden we started getting these Alvin Kamara's and these Christian McCaffreys. And what happened was some teams started using these pass catching backs, these dynamic. Chase Edmonds and Le'Veon Bell was where it all, not Chase Edmonds, DJ Johnson and Le'Veon Bell was where it all started. And other teams started saying, well, this is powerful. And CMC and Saquon and Kamara and all these guys got drafted and developed into these workhorse pass catching roles. And then that became the new trend, right? So it was like pay up at running back. And then those guys started getting hurt. The investments in those guys started falling apart, and teams have gone back heavily to this, almost every team, 65-35 split for their lead backs. And then people are still in the pay up at running back mindset. So now we start to find, okay, if everybody else is still stuck in what worked a couple of years ago, we shift over to something else. So yeah, we'll keep an eye on it throughout the season. There's always little things, right? Whether it's Josh Allen being super underpriced in 2018, Deontay Johnson being super underpriced in 2020, maybe Jahan Dotson is that this year. Finding these guys who are super underpriced and we get in on them beforehand just because we're paying attention and having a willingness to open up our minds, or just in terms of how players are being used, how teams are deploying players, how everyone else is structuring their rosters, assuming that what happened in the past will keep happening, and how we can pivot as a result. So I haven't seen anything yet that really stands out to me in that regard, but I think as this season goes on, there will be little things that we start to see where the field is stuck in the old way of thinking and we can adjust to the new way of thinking.
Yeah, and that's what's so great about DFS, even relative to how you think about season long and in adjusting your priors, is there's this push pull of overreacting or underreacting, because we do have really meaningful, data points. Sean Siegel over at RotoViz was writing about drafts that took place after the Thursday night games for the FFPC. And now he felt people were actually underreacting to that information we got just because we've had it drilled in our head that we're supposed to not overreact. But with DFS, it's like we can play it both ways. If our opponents are overreacting, then we can underreact, and vice versa. If they're underreacting to a new trend, let's say the Commanders or, something like that, then we can lean into that. And you mentioned that with the Josh Allen example a few years ago, where that stuff takes a while for the field to really believe it.
Right. And the more that we can change our mindset, and this is something obviously we'll be focused on all year in this show. It's something we're focused on all the time on OWS, but the more we can shift our mindset from thinking that DFS is a game of out predicting everybody else and move over to the understanding of where there is uncertainty, we want to be able to leverage that to our advantage. And that basically means if everyone else is, if chalk is forming on a play that's more uncertain than the field realizes, don't be afraid to miss out. If the guy hits, fine, that's 1 week. But over time, letting chalk uncertainty is great for you. You move off of that chalk. On the flip side, if everyone is avoiding a player because of uncertainty, the EV just climbs and climbs and climbs. Your expected value over time, embracing that uncertainty on your own rosters, is going to make you money over time by just saying, okay, well, everyone else is a little too scared of this spot. Everyone else is thinking that they might be overreacting, underreacting here. They want to wait and see on this spot. Well, we can take advantage of that and embrace that uncertainty. And again, just differentiate from the field, because the more we can find good plays that are on a different path than everybody else, the more often we're going to win tournaments.
Do you think we are going to get a classic overreaction for week 2 where everyone saw how much the chalk hit? And I was even getting comments like that. Pete, you care too much about ownership. You're being too galaxy brain, all of this. It does feel like if you get burned, and you wrote a nice piece for us in Fantasy Life too about how most people lost money week 1, and there's going to be a natural hesitancy to tighten up. No one wants to punt it off 2 weeks in a row. Is that a dynamic you think we can exploit this week?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, you should embrace the chalk. We should have all known that the Colts were going to have 92 plays. We should have all known that Michael Pittman was going to get 13 targets because Matt Ryan was going to throw 50 passes, because this game was the Colts were going to dominate time of possession and then have a full overtime quarter. No, I think that people have a hard time separating why chalk hit from the fact that chalk hit. So it's like the range of outcomes is still broad. We just saw one path for the game to play out along. And so over time, we're always going to make more money if we're not doing the exact same thing as the field. It's very important to understand that DFS strategy, DFS theory doesn't mean just taking low-owned plays. A lot of times low-owned plays equal worse plays than the popular plays, but it's just finding you can have an entirely chalk roster if it's put together in a totally unique manner that nobody else has it. The main thing is people don't build in DFS for first place by and large. They think they're building for first place, but they're just putting players onto a roster that they like. Whereas the moment you start constantly thinking about, does this roster have a path to first place? What is this roster's path to first place? And kind of digging into that, you make very different decisions across the board. And it's tournament by tournament, size by size, entry maxes by entry maxes, but thinking through what you're doing in that regard. And yeah, in that Fantasy Life piece, I brought up the fact that everybody comes out of week 1 just looking through the lens of their own experience, what happened to them. Well, if we look macro, right, tournament players, only about 20% of tournament fields cash. So at most, we've got 20% of players being profitable, but a lot of that 20% of cashing entries is taken up by 150 max players who, have 30, 40 rosters that cashed. So that takes away spots from other people. Or maybe somebody puts in 5 rosters, one of them cashes, but they still lost money on the weekend. So a good 90 to 95% of the DFS field is looking through the lens of their own experience. And they're like, oh man, I had a bad week 1. I was certain I was going to make money. I was prepping for this slate for weeks and I lost money. And so then they want to kind of gravitate more toward what they feel is a safe play. That's why we're going to see Bengals defense at 40% owned. How could they not fail? Well, there's very clear ways that they could not be the top defense on the slate, that they're not 40% favorites to be the top defense on the slate. But people are going to gravitate more and more toward that because they're like, God, I don't want to lose money again. And so the more that we can kind of recognize that and shift our thinking to that macro perspective and say, look, DFS is a game in which the moment you put your roster in, you should essentially consider that money gone. And then any money you get back is great because over time, we're not trying to cash rosters. We're trying to get first place in tournaments. It would be better to cash a few fewer times and get one first place finish than to cash a few extra times and not be putting yourself in position for a first place finish.
Yeah. And I mean, it's the paradox of DFS too, that you're going to have more losing weeks than is comfortable to ultimately accomplish your goal. And so when you're doing content too, that can be tough. Like I'm now accustomed to coming on here and eating shit on Mondays, reviewing my lineups, but I feel good about my path to first and giving myself that path. It's not going to hit every time. In fact, it's not going to hit most of the time, but I do really think, and that goes back to also stuff you've talked about as well, like knowing your bankroll, knowing your budget, being honest with it. I like your analogy too about, that money being gone when you do it. I think of it like poker chips. We bought into the tournament and now those chips are devoid of monetary value. We're just trying to win a game. I wanted to ask you, and I think I asked you this last year and I can't remember, but because you do approach kind of lineup building from such a unique perspective, I think you end up on lots of naturally contrarian things. But do you double check, say, like your projected points or your projected cumulative or product ownership compared to what you think are maybe chalk builds or standard stacks? Or is it just knowing that how you're approaching it, that it will be unique inherently?
I want to bring in as much information as I can without allowing that information to be dominant in my thinking. So by the end of the week, by Saturday, I'm going to look at everything. I'm going to look at projections. I'm going to look at the projections of my roster. I'm going to look at ownership projections. I'm going to look at everything. But I think there's a tendency to allow the information we take in to become authoritative in our minds. And so maybe you've built all week and then you go read the player grid, which is my player pool on OWS. And you go read the player grid and you're like, oh God, JM's not on this guy that I was on all week. And so now I'm scared to play this guy. I'm going to move off of him, right? You have to be able to have your own takes be authoritative. And the best way to do that is to make sure that you've thought deeply into your own takes. So yeah, for me, I want to take in everything, but also I want to recognize, like, we talked about Carson Wentz last week, right? And when I brought up Carson Wentz, I think I brought him up before the show and you were like, and that's kind of the reaction to Carson Wentz. And I started like the deeper into, I was convicted on Carson Wentz last week. And the deeper I got into the week, the more I was like, you know what, in the contest I'm in, 1,000 entries, 500 entries, 200 entries, I don't need the Carson Wentz risk, which was true technically. But at the same time, if I feel really good about this play at this price, there's also there needs to be a willingness to say, okay, like my average result in a DFS week is losing. That's the point of this game. But what gives me my best path to first place? Well, if I think this guy has the upside at the price, let's take the swing on it, And so, yeah, I want to take in everything and also not be a slave to any one set of numbers or not be too afraid to kind of stick with what I thought early on, but also be willing to have, evolving thoughts and opinions throughout the week.
For sure. And I mean, evolving, that is the operative word there. I mean, last week when we did an early one and we were looking at one of the building blocks, we used a Trey Lance, stack there. And obviously by Sunday rolling around, I was going to play Lance as one of my main 2 lineups. I got very spooked off by the weather at Soldier Field, which did seem like an outlier weather scenario, but it goes to show what we're trying to do here. And I know what JM's entire goal, it's literally spelled out on his background behind him, is to think, to teach us how to think about these puzzle pieces. So you can make that pivot of, all right, the Trey Lance building block doesn't look is good anymore. And I sympathize with the Carson Wentz thing too, because I was looking at the quarterback plays and I kept staring at that Justin Herbert ownership. And I was like, I feel like I don't have to go that far off the board if the field really isn't attacking what seemed like an incredible spot.
Yeah. And that was one of the great things about that spot was it was clearly one of the top plays on the slate, but people just weren't loading up on it as much as they could have, should have, needed to, whatever. And again, easy to be results oriented, but then we go back, we watched the game last night and Mike Williams blows up for this monster game. Obviously Keenan Allen was out, but we see the upside that's there. It's like, just because it didn't hit on the small sample size of 1 week doesn't mean that it was the wrong play, doesn't mean that it can't hit or couldn't have hit if we played the slate out over and over again. And one of the things that I would encourage viewers, listeners to kind of shift their thinking on is we as humans are so geared toward finding answers. And the reality is in almost every situation, our answers are uncertain. We don't know. And so the more that we shift from chasing after answers and move instead toward chasing after questions and like uncovering what all the different questions are, then the more we're able to say, oh, look at the way that this question could potentially be answered. Look at the way that this question could potentially be answered. Because, you know, it's a simple way to look at things, right? But if 800 years ago, you told people that the world was round, you would have been put in an insane asylum, right? Like if you would have said that 200 years ago that cutting your arm open to let out bad blood so that you would no longer be sick, if you said that was dumb, like you'd be laughed out of the barber shop. Things change, right? We learn new things, we develop. What were answers in the past are not necessarily the certain answers, even though we think that they are the certain answers. And so just taking that over to DFS and saying, okay, like what are the questions that we can be asking? And the more we kind of search for the questions, the more we're going to find those unique paths that other people aren't finding.
Yeah, and speaking of unique paths, let's start to shift our focus towards this week 2 slate. I know we have some injury situations, of course, that are still pending. That's going to be the crux of recording on Friday. And actually, maybe before we get into that, just so people understand the cadence of when you guys release a lot of your content, the player grid, all of that stuff with the scroll, because I do know, even for myself, you know, we're all still finding the rhythm of when we're consuming this information, when we're establishing our lineup building time. So when can people expect stuff from you guys over the weekend?
So the NFL Edge, which is again 100% free outside of the DFS interpretations, all you need is an OWS free membership. This is not a membership where it's like put in your credit card and if you forget to cancel, we'll charge you. It's just a free membership. Okay. So OWS free, you have access to all of the game by game breakdowns. Those start coming onto the site on Thursdays. By the end of Thursday, those are completely populated on the site. And then as we talked about last week, we try to make things as simple on you as possible as a visitor to the site to know where to go. So it's the NFL Edge is going to have all of your research, all of your game by game breakdowns, the scroll, which you can find in the NFL drop-down menu at the top of the site, or you can find featured on the home page on Saturdays. The scroll is going to have, so if you go to that NFL tab at the top, you'll see the scroll is right there. The scroll is going to have all of your late week content. So you see all these articles on the side are the different articles, but you can just jump from article to article within this larger article. So these start coming onto the site on Friday. My player grid, which is where the building blocks can be found, comes onto the site Friday evening, Friday night. Mike's player grid comes onto the site on Friday evening, Friday night. And then a lot of the other stuff comes onto the site on Saturday. But check out the scroll, and it basically, if anything's not populated, it tells you when to expect it each week. So research stuff on Thursday, Friday in the NFL Edge, obviously still there on Saturday. And then the scroll is your Friday, Saturday roster construction strategy destination. Those are really the only, outside of the tools, those are the only two places you really need to be paying attention to on the site each week.
Yep. And they got all kinds of different type of passes. If you want to hit it and quit it with a weekly pass, you can do that. If you want to put a ring on it with the OWS for life, you could swing in that direction. So
we've had 3 OWS for life signups this last week. So shout out to those people joining us for life. And it's a good deal. If you're going to be with us for 4, if you're still playing DFS 4 years from now, you've already paid for the subscription. So that's one to think about as well.
There you go. And of course, as usual, you can get 20% off any of those OWS subs with promo code Pete. Got those links down below. what are you thinking for week 2 as far as how the field is generally going to be approaching this slate? And we talked a little bit about maybe chasing some of those chalk performances, but any other things you think our opponents are largely going to be doing this Sunday?
I'm going to throw that back to you. Do you have any early thoughts on that?
Well, I do think, outside of some of the plays that project very well, I do think we're going to gravitate to a few games. I know that the field really likes this Arizona and Raiders game, looking at that, projected over under. I think we're going to see a lot revolving around the Bengals and Joe Mixon. I mean, both project well, and that's just such a comfy correlation there. And Darrell Henderson, I think, as well at running back, just after we got the Cam Akers information last week, I think he's going to be very popular. So, the one thing I'm seeing right now, even just looking at optimals, is a lot of Derek Carr, Devontae Adams, bring it back with Greg Dortch, and you play Joe Mixon with Bengals D, and boom, you got yourself a nice lineup.
Yeah, it's funny. Greg Dortch early in the week, it was like, early ownership projections are relatively pointless, but early ownership projections were like 1%, 2%. And literally every projection system I looked at, I did a show with Joe Holke yesterday, and he said that Reeves has been talking about Dortch all week as the best play on the slate. Like, by the time we get to Sunday, Dortch is going to be one of these 20% owned guys. And so, sure. I'm with you there. I think that there's not necessarily, like, what we see sometimes is the one game that everybody's focused on, right? You have 3 games with an over under above 50, but one of them is at 53 and the other 2 are like 50, 50 and a half. And everybody's on this 53-point game. And we can say, look, there's other good games over here. We don't really have that this week. We have several teams that are projected to win in blowouts. The Rams, the 49ers, the Raiders by 6 points, the Broncos by 10 points. Rams, 49ers, and Broncos are all 10-point plus favorites. And then the Raiders. And those are the only teams that have Vegas implied team totals of about 4 touchdowns. And so it's an interesting week in that there's not this push and pull where the field is all on this one game. We can go somewhere else. And so I think that, you kind of laid out some individual players that people are going to be drawn toward. I think we can throw Saquon into that bucket as well. These individual players, I feel really good about this. I feel really good about this. And again, that doesn't mean you can't play those guys. It just means that you have to play those guys differently than the field is playing them in some way.
Right. Yeah. And the other thing too, looking at just the slate dynamics, a lot of those more appetizing games are in the late slate. I would say outside of Lions Commanders, which I think is going to end up being a little trendy. I mean, you got the Atlanta Rams game, you have the Cincy Dallas, you have LV, Las Vegas, Arizona, and Denver, Houston there. So it does seem like a week too where, and I'm curious how you think about this. I definitely, in general, like having some of my more contrarian plays early to just give me that information edge. And then it lets me know, it's a little easier to eat the Joe Mixon chalk or this chalk stack if my contrarian low owned piece hits early. Do you think about things from that late swap perspective, or how the configuration of your lineup changes with that information?
I think about it. I take it into account. I also think that it can be dangerous, right? Because if we are playing for first place, and it's easy to come out of the early games and say, okay, well, Joe Mixon is, whatever. And I feel safe with him, but then, everybody has him. And so he doesn't really separate you from the field. Like, you have to really hit in those early games, or even like our assumptions going into the late games can still be wrong, right? It was maybe 2 years ago that Brandon Adams, a friend of the site, had a couple rosters, like a duped roster that finished like 3rd and 4th in the Millie Maker. And it was because this roster, he'll create like about 75 rosters for the Millie Maker. And then the ones that still appear to be live, he'll make changes to them heading into the late games. This roster didn't appear to be live. And then the late games hit to such a high level for him on these rosters that he ended up finishing at the top of the Millie Maker, but with a duped lineup, right? And so we have these assumptions where we head into the late games and we're like, okay, so this means this. And so we don't want to think ourselves out of money. So if we can have that as like 5% of our thought process, then I think it's sharp. If we start making that kind of the basis of our thought process, we still get into thinking we can predict exactly what's going to happen in X games and get in trouble there. But yeah, late swap is just a huge edge if you use it, but you have to use it correctly. I think I don't want to ever overuse it, but especially on a week like this where you can say, okay, well, I'm in good shape here And so this is my plan, right? Like if you have your plan set before you head into the late games, I'm in good shape, so I'm sticking with my plan, or I'm in bad shape, so I'm shifting my plan to plan B and have those plans set up in advance.
Right. And that is the thing too. I found with that is even I like having those 2v2s and some of those swaps laid out in advance. And yet almost unless you're like running away with a lead, I'm still almost always defaulting to my more contrarian side or my initial angle. Like it would be a very nice problem to have a 20-point lead and be like, you know what, we can tighten up here and play some chalk to hold
20-point lead and you've got the same number of player minutes left as everybody else. You're like, well, sure. Now I feel pretty good about this.
Exactly. Do want to hit this one. Didn't want to forget this. So DK Listener League. Yes, we got that spun up. Finally got in contact with some people at DraftKings to get that going. I'm making that link available in the Discord. So that's in the Deposit Kingdom Discord. I have the links down below. If you go to the announcement section, it is, I believe, the most latest announcement. And as of now, only, if I can do math, 17 spots left, 233 out of 250. So it will fill here in the next 5 minutes. So go get in there and we'll make it bigger next week. But I had to feel it out here. So it's a fun tournament, $10, single entry, rake free, very smooth payout structure, 250 to first, 2x min cash for everyone, 10th place, a 10th of first. So nice structure there. Hop in the Deposit Kingdom Weekly League. JM, let's talk about this concept of blocks, because I know it's something we referenced last week. It's a way you are thinking and approaching a lot of your DFS lineup builds. We have a name here for the show we're going to call the Block Party. Explain for people what this concept means and kind of how you use it to formulate your DFS decisions.
There is a misconception about stacking, that stacking elevates your upside, or people who don't like stacking or taking multiple players from the same team. I remember a few years ago when Levitan and I had our show together, and it was when Chris Godwin was still cheap. And the big question of the week was Adam Humphries or Chris Godwin. And my answer was both, right? They cost like 7.5K combined. And it was like, if you tally up their targets and their production expectation, and you think of that in terms of, instead of two different roster spots, you think of that in terms of one block of 7.5K in salary, it becomes so much more valuable. And I believe Levitan called that the double condom strategy. And then, they come out and they both put up, 22 to 25 points, and you end up getting this 45 to 50 point game from your 7.5K wide receiver. And so as long as we can find if we can find a place where it's so hard to get guaranteed points on our roster, it's so hard to get points on our roster. And so if we can find a place where we are locking in a floor of points, that helps us so much. Not every player on your roster has to be the player who wins you the tournament. Now, you can have a player block or a stack that goes for 5x the salary of that block as a whole, right? And keeps you on a 250 point pace. But even if they go for 3.5x, 3.7x, 3.8x, and they're keeping you on that 175, 180, 190 point pace, it's just so valuable to have points locked into your roster. The other thing to think about in DFS is, with how much we don't know, once we acknowledge that, this becomes so much easier to understand. With how much we don't know every week, and if you still don't believe that that's true, predict everything this week and then go either watch to see how many of those predictions fail, or watch to see all the breaks that have to go the right way for those predictions to hit. So whether it's game flow or a fluky big play or whatever it is that was unpredictable. And so once we understand how unpredictable things are, we can basically say, if I'm trying to guess 9 spots right on the roster, mathematically, my chances of guessing 9 out of 9 are so much lower than my chances of guessing 6 out of 6 or 5 out of 5. And so when we put together a player block where we bet on this production, so like the Eckler, Herbert, and Jacobs one last week, that was essentially the one bet was, this is one of the Chargers' super high scoring games. If you're wrong, then this block probably doesn't kill you, but it's not going to win you a tournament. If you're right, though, you're so far ahead of the field. So it's this one bet. And so now 3 spots are covered with one bet. And now I need to get 7 things right on this roster instead of needing to get 9 things right on this roster. And so if you can put 1 or 2 of those things on every roster, it's why if you go through the top DFS players, you so frequently see quarterback, running back, wide receiver, bring back, or quarterback, pass catcher, bring back, right? Like 4 guys from this one game. And that might not be what wins them the tournament. Awesemo's like main rosters last week were, at least in his 3 max play. Okay. Tua plus 3 pass catchers on one roster, Tua, Chase Edmonds, 2 pass catchers on another, right? That's not the play that's going to win you the tournament. But if that game plays out the way that you need it to, you pick up all these guaranteed points as your starting point, and then you've got these other guys who can kind of vulture up the leaderboards from there. And so finding these building blocks, and ideally what we always want to look for in a building block that is kind of different from just a pure stack is like the Jacobs and Herbert and Eckler one. If it's one that basically is different enough to immediately set your roster apart, then you really get some differentiation from the field, because you can kind of start picking and choosing your favorite spots in a lot of spots from there. And so, yeah, it's finding blocks of where we can bet on one thing happening that gets us a large haul of points for the salary we're spending, and thinking less about the 9 player spots and more about what we get for each chunk of salary we spend. And then on top of that, any place where that can differentiate us, a little bit or a lot, makes the block even more powerful.
Yeah, and I think that's such an important distinction. It was one I thought about a lot through best ball season, this idea of you have per play correlation, the quarterback and wide receiver being correlated, but you also have the season-long correlation. Some of these teams are just going to smash. And that's one thing I notice about your lineups a lot of times is you're willing to do correlations, but they're not necessarily on a per play level. And maybe you have a running back and wide receiver from the same team. Every time one of those guys is getting a point, the other isn't. And yet, if the pie is so big and you're correlating on a team level or on a game level, in the Jacobs example, you can still get there in a really unique way. And so it's like you're still doing the thing that we want with correlations, which is eliminating the number of things we have to get right, but you're approaching it from a slightly different angle. Whereas I just know for myself, it's so much more comfy to do a quarterback with a wide receiver and a pass catcher coming back. That's what we want to default with. I have to fight that. But when you're really looking at the projected points, sure, you're sacrificing a little per play correlation, but over the course of 4 quarters, that could be a minuscule factor.
The pie thing is the perfect way to put it. If it's a big pie and these guys are eating 40% of it, that's more valuable than a small pie where you're, getting the direct correlation. And so betting on game environments instead of just the per play correlation can be valuable. And in every one of these situations, you have to think through how it works out. You have to actually say, what is the actual game environment I need here? Like I knew very specifically that the Herbert and Eckler and Jacobs one, I needed that game to be a super high scoring game. If it wasn't, then this block wasn't going to be a reason I was going to win tournaments, and could even be the reason I didn't win tournaments. But if I know what scenario I'm betting on, a very specific scenario that you can kind of walk through, and I'll say this too, showdowns is a great way to sharpen your ability to kind of think through very specific scenario-based builds. And actually on the site, we have a Mastering Showdowns course from Xanamir that's free to all members, including OWS free members. And then he has like 4 other showdown courses in our DFS education section that basically kind of walks through all the numbers of showdown and all the different ways. He even has like a single game course that just shows you how to think through a single game, and essentially just saying, how do I take this from showdowns and then apply it to the larger slate? People always say, well, it's kind of harder when there's 13 games on a slate. There's so many options. But if you can start thinking game based, then you start finding the places where it's like, oh, this game is one I want to bet on, and I want to bet on this specific scenario. And now you've made 3 or 4 decisions on your roster already, and it makes things so much easier. And it also kind of starts pushing some other buttons for you. It starts highlighting some other buttons. I think we talked about this last week, right? Like if I'm playing Mark Andrews, I'm ideally saying that Travis Kelce doesn't have a blow-up game in week 1. And I still think the Chiefs are going to succeed. So now that I've played Mark Andrews, it doesn't mean I have to play Juju Smith-Schuster, but it kind of highlights that Juju button. It's like, hey, look, your clearest path to first place on a Mark Andrews build is Travis Kelce disappointing. How does Travis Kelce disappoint? Probably from one of the other pass catchers getting those points instead. So it's like, once you get one of those blocks in place, or one of those blocks plus a couple players, it starts really highlighting the additional plays for you. And the roster builds itself from that point forward, which makes things a lot easier and gives you a much more strategically built roster.
So getting more specific into the blocks stuff, and I got a sneak peek of some of your blocks from this week. We're actually going to build a lineup here in a second with one of them. A few of them will be available for free on OWS. And then to get the other ones, you got to be an OWS subscriber. But where's your starting point for identifying blocks? I've noticed a few themes just seeing them that I could maybe pull apart, but I'm more curious, are you just looking for the best plays? Are you looking for a contrarian angle? Where is the starting point for finding a block?
I don't know if I have an answer in terms of like something that's consistent week to week, but what I do is by the time, so I used to write the entire NFL Edge myself, which was not great for me and really not great for subscribers because I wasn't able to like dig as deeply into the games as I wanted to dig into. And so now at this point, I come through and I put in my interpretations in the NFL Edge, which is like my DFS thoughts on the slate. And before I get to that point, I have gone through every game on the slate 4 times. And each time I go through it, I'm kind of looking for different things. So the first time I'm just game by game, not really focused on players and jotting down my initial thoughts on each game. And then second time through, I start researching different things, making different notes. Third time through, I'm researching other things, making different notes. Fourth time through, same thing. And so by the time I get to the NFL Edge, and now I'm reading this stuff that Mike or Hilo or Poppy has spent 3, 4, 5 hours researching themselves and putting together their game write-up, I can see what matches up to everything I found, all of my thoughts, and then kind of form my final thoughts there. And then I start building my player pool for the player grid, which is my last chance to say, okay, let me make sure there's nothing I'm overlooking. Let me pull out all these pieces and then start saying, okay, and these are like, this week I had a list of maybe 18 possible building blocks. And then you kind of start narrowing it down to, okay, well, this one's sharper than the other ones. This one's sharper than the other ones. And you get down to sort of your 4 or 5 sharpest ones. And yeah, that's kind of the broad process for me in getting to that point.
Well, let's dive in here just because I want to make sure we have enough time to kind of talk through the block. I know last week we were a little rushed. I was heading to the airport, so I'm excited to make a little bit more of a meal of thinking through lineup construction from this block standpoint. So why don't you kick us off with one that has been particularly interesting for you? And when you sent it over, it was pretty intriguing to me as well.
Yeah, I sent you a few options, and this one was, I think, an immediate selection for you, and that is Matthew Stafford, Darrell Henderson, and Allen Robinson. You could also throw in Ben Skoranek instead of Allen Robinson. You could also throw in Tyler Higbee instead of Allen Robinson. And as always, what we want to do is describe the story that we're telling. We don't want to blindly put a bunch of players onto our roster. We want to say, this roster is betting on this specific outcome. So already we see that we have a quarterback, a running back who doesn't catch that many passes. Like with Eckler, if you're putting in Eckler, he caught 8 touchdown passes last year, right? So he's still correlated to Herbert in that they can double up points. Henderson might catch 1 or 2 touchdown passes this year. So you're not betting on him catching touchdown passes, but what you're betting on here is Rams smash. You're betting on the Rams scoring at least 4 touchdowns, ideally 5 touchdowns. If the Rams score 4 or 5 touchdowns, who are the players that are getting these touchdowns that are not on this list, right? Like Stafford is going to be involved in those touchdowns, or Henderson's going to be involved in those touchdowns. We have a unique week too, where there isn't a game that if we played out this slate 100 times, 85 times, there's not going to be 90 times, there's not going to be a game on this slate where both teams are just trading blows and scoring 35 plus points, right? And so if you find that team that's in a potential blowout win, but they still score 5 touchdowns or even just 4 touchdowns, that's what you need this week, right? So we always want to think about what each individual slate gives us. On this individual slate, the team that scores 4 or 5 touchdowns is probably the top team. Now, Cooper Kupp is a strong play. Like I wouldn't play Cooper Kupp with Henderson and Stafford because you really need Kupp at his price tag to hit ceiling. And so you don't want Henderson taking away points from him. But what we're essentially able to bet on here is not just the Rams smashing, but also we don't think Cooper Kupp's going to have a bad game. How could he? But you're hoping that Cooper Kupp has one of his 24, 26-point games and that the spillover goes to these other pass catchers. So again, whether it's Allen Robinson or Ben Skoranek or Tyler Higbee, we threw Allen Robinson onto this one. It's an interesting situation, right? Allen Robinson looked dead last year, but Allen Robinson also looked kind of disinterested last year. And why wouldn't you be disinterested in another year in Matt Nagy's offense with that, everything going wrong with that team? And all the reports out of training camp were that Allen Robinson looked phenomenal. And sure, he doesn't really separate from cornerbacks, but that's never been his thing. And so we could see the Rams say, look, let's emphasize Allen Robinson in this one. He had 2 targets last week. Let's make sure that he gets 7, 8, 9 targets. Let's make sure we throw to him in the end zone. Teams do that, especially if they're up in a game. They're like, hey, let's get this guy a score. And so this is a way to say we're able to bet on the highest total offense on the slate. Matthew Stafford, I think it was in, Mike laid out all these numbers in the player grid, and they'll be in the Oracle as well, but not the player grid, in the NFL Edge. So you can find that for free. But like Stafford's games last year of 3+ touchdowns, 300+ yards, it was outrageous how frequently he did it. I think it was something like 9 out of 17 games he had 3 passing touchdowns, and like every game where they scored 30 points, he had 3 passing touchdowns. Again, these are numbers off the top of my head, but Mike laid everything out in the NFL Edge. And so Stafford is just like a high floor, high ceiling play at his price tag. If we, again, always want to talk about the numbers, like boil things down to actual numbers. Stafford throws 300 yards. Well, that's 15 points. Stafford passes for 3 touchdowns. That's another 12 points. So all of a sudden we're at 27 points at 6,300. Throwing a few extra yards, throwing another touchdown, and Stafford's blowing up in this game. And so what this effectively does is it allows us to get some leverage off Cooper Kupp by saying we're betting on a different pass catcher. So if Kupp doesn't have a had-to-have-it game, those points are spilling over to other pass catchers, and now we get those points. And then also Darrell Henderson, we get kind of the complete package here where Henderson will be popular, but Henderson combinatorially with Matthew Stafford, Allen Robinson, that's not going to be popular. So if the offense as a whole smashes, we lower our ownership. And one more note here that's actually pretty interesting. You could play Stafford, Henderson, no other pass catcher, and it would be really weird to other people and nobody would do it. But what you would basically be saying there is Kupp has like his 30-point game, 32-point game. And yet I still think I can get better point per dollar production from 9.9K in salary. So if you say, look, I don't actually need that 32 points from Kupp, but let's say that Stafford has, right? Kupp goes 8 catches, 120 yards. That's a monster game, right? And a touchdown. That's still 29 DraftKings points. 120 yards, right? And Stafford throws for 300. The other 180 are kind of spread out to a bunch of different guys. No other pass catchers have a had-to-have-it game. Robinson gets 13 points. Higbee gets 11 points. Skoranek gets 12 points. You don't actually need that other pass catcher even. And Stafford could have a 30-point game. Henderson could have a 25-point game. Nobody would have that pairing. It's a super unique one, but I wanted to throw the pass catcher on here so we don't chase anybody away from our show too quickly. And we complete this bet. We get some leverage off of Cooper Kupp, some lower ownership, and we effectively still get to bet on the Rams smashing, which is what everybody's betting on with Darrell Henderson. Hey, he's got this big role, and the Rams are going to score a lot of points. He could get 1 or 2 touchdowns. Yeah, but where are all the rest of the touchdowns coming from, right? The rest of the touchdowns are coming through the air. So we make the same bet that all the Darrell Henderson people are betting on, but we totally lower our ownership here so that we complete the bet. And so as everybody else gets just a portion of the points from this bet, we get all the points from this bet. Ideally, we pick the right pass catcher and, we end up cruising up the leaderboards from there.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to unpack there. And I do think the sticking point, and first of all, let's do just, I know I always do this, but I also want to do table setting again, because I know a lot of people watch this, they end up liking these ideas. It makes sense. It's coherent. First of all, a lot changes between now and then. You're going to need to keep tabs on all of this stuff. I mean, keep tabs on Akers, injury reports, all that stuff, caveats always included here, but also thinking about ownership here too. And what was interesting for me, the way you laid this out, is Henderson, a lot of people are going to play. A lot of people are going to play Stafford to Kupp. But you're saying we can get the benefits of those popular pieces, but by approaching it from a different angle, a different combination, that we can still be unique and also save some salary in certain cases.
Yeah, the people who are playing Henderson, they're making the same bet as us. They're
Right.
just saying the Rams dominate this game. The Rams score a lot of points. But we also want to recognize, again, we're so black and white in our thinking by and large. And it's like, oh, blowout win, you can't play the quarterback. But look at Mahomes last week, right? Like teams keep throwing into the fourth quarter, even with a huge lead. The Rams have plenty of 30-10 wins on their ledger, 30-13 wins, games like that, where they keep scoring points and the opponent isn't scoring points. And so people betting on Henderson, what they just don't realize that they're actually placing a larger bet that says Rams smash. And so we say, cool, we'll complete that bet. And that's the same thing. I mean, same thing with Davante Adams and Greg Dortch, which if it becomes more and more popular, it becomes less and less valuable. But basically it's like a bet on Davante Adams is a bet on him having this monster game. Well, if he's having a monster game, the Cardinals are having to pass that much more, and Greg Dortch is that much more likely to see volume pile up again. And so if you make the Davante Adams bet, you're literally betting on Greg Dortch having volume as well. And so you complete the bet. And so when we can look for those places where it's like, yeah, people they're making their play and not realizing that the actual bet they're placing has more pieces to it, more components to it. So we complete the bet ourselves and actually get the full benefit of it. And again, from the pass catcher standpoint, there's uncertainty here. We don't know that if it's going to be Robinson or if it's going to be, the Skoranek one is great because nobody's going to have him any super cheap, right? So he's not going to crush your roster. He's going to be out there every play. Higbee, you get the tight end position filled. But Allen Robinson, we also know that he could have a 70-yard, 2-touchdown game. He can have a monster game here. And we want to find one of these pieces that can kind of help us complete this bet and separate us from everybody else who's placing this bet and move us up the leaderboards.
So I think the next logical extension or the next question to ask if we've made this bet with this block is, does a Falcons player need to be along for the ride to help push these guys to the extreme outcomes? Or is it more of a Chiefs scenario where this can be such a smash spot for the Rams that they don't even need to be pushed by the opposition? Because that's always the trip in my head of being like, man, I really need the Rams to put up 40 here. How do they get to 40? Is it with the Falcons hanging around?
I'll say this. By and large, the sharpest DFS players are never going to give themselves an opportunity to overthink this. They're just always going to do the bring back. Because of that, and because I'm typically focused on high dollar, smaller field tournaments against those players, I like to think more deeply into each of these situations. And I'm always going to be less likely than the field to have a bring back if I find a spot. So like last week, all of OWS was high on this idea of betting on Chiefs smash. And you just load up on Chiefs and don't actually have an Arizona bring back and hope that the Chiefs smash and that Arizona disappoints and everybody with the Arizona bring back kind of is losing some ground there. So this is a situation like that. It's totally 100% fine to have this. At the same time, it's never wrong to have the bring back if you're betting on 3 pieces, because 3 pieces, as we talked about, especially where they're not correlated on a per play basis, 3 pieces is a bet on the Rams just scoring a ton of touchdowns, scoring a bunch of points. And so in that scenario, it's never wrong to bring back from the other side. The matchup's awful for Atlanta, but they have a super concentrated offense, right? We know that Pitts and Drake London both saw 7 targets last week, and Mariota threw 33 passes. We could see Mariota have to throw a little bit more here. They had a huge lead last week for most of the game. So we could see Mariota throw a little bit more here. We could see one of these guys have 8 or 9 catches. I don't expect to do the bring back myself in the contest I'm going to be in, because again, I'm competing against people who do the auto bring back. And so I want to find a way to separate a little bit, but I'll leave it up to you here if we put Drake London on here or go a different direction. I want to save tight end for another guy that I want to touch on. So, but I think Drake London's very interesting. He's only 5,200. He's going to get targets, and it's easy to say, oh, tough matchup, I don't want to go there, but he certainly has ceiling if you want to throw him on.
Yeah, let's not force it. And then if we come back and it feels like a logical spot then, and where we're just kind of free rolling the correlation bring back and he's one of the better plays, then we can do it. So yeah, what's your next step here? Like, are you, because you're obviously going to have multiple blocks and angles you like, are you looking to get multiple blocks in the same lineup, or are you now just trying to fill this out in the most logical way?
always different, right? Like one of the blocks I sent you, and this one is broken down for free in the player grid, or will be. We're recording this live. It'll be live on the site by, I don't know, 7 p.m. Eastern, 8 p.m. Eastern in the player grid. But we'll break down the numbers on this one. But one of the interesting blocks this week is Saquon plus Christian McCaffrey, where people will like both running backs, but might question playing them together. So you can just go to the next block. One of the things that I would actually want to do here real quickly is I want to have a sense of what salary I have. And there is a cheap tight end I really like this week. And so I want to put him in just to have a sense. I don't know for sure that I'm playing this guy this week, but the guy is Juwan Johnson.
Yeah.
Do you know what his price is this week? It's $2,500.
Oh yeah, it's the Stone Min. The Min.
Crazy. And so this is a guy, 5 targets last week, 12.2 ADOT, which is huge for a tight end. And if you don't know anything about Juwan Johnson, he was like a beat writer hype machine last offseason from his pass catching prowess. And he just wasn't ready yet to see the field much. And, you know, all of a sudden we get into week 1, he played 1 or 2 fewer snaps than all of Michael Thomas, Chris Olave, and Jarvis Landry. So he's part of like their 4 pass catchers. He ran or maybe I'm wrong on the snaps, but he ran 1 to 2 fewer pass routes than all those guys. When he's out there, he pass blocked on 1 play. He ran 33 pass routes. He's out there as a pass catcher. He was getting used downfield. He had a sick play last week where he hurdled some guy downfield on a downfield catch. So Juwan Johnson, 2,500 in a game. The Bucs faced the highest opponent pass play rate in the NFL last season. The Bucs faced over 40 pass attempts per game last year. Just that's their average pass attempt space per game because you can't run on them. And so this is a very interesting spot where you're going to see some volume. Maybe he only gets 4 targets, right? But he's 2,500, doesn't kill you. And he could see 7, 8 targets, could have big plays, could have touchdowns. This isn't like 6 targets from Jonnu Smith and they're all 3 yards away from the line of scrimmage, right? Like there's serious upside here. So what I like about this is now we have a sense of what we have in terms of salary in other spots. And then what do you think? Do we want to throw in that Saquon CMC block, or do we want to go a different direction next?
Let's toss that in. I think that's really interesting too, especially when you think about constructions with Matthew Stafford that I think by and large are going to include Cooper Kupp. And so then when you have a $9,900 Cooper Kupp, it's going to be really hard to get up to an $8,900 Christian McCaffrey. And so I think that naturally is flipping the build in a pretty unique way.
That's my guy, Pete. Yeah, that's exactly. And so we're making this Stafford bet where the bet we're making is Rams score a bunch of touchdowns, but Cooper Kupp doesn't have a had-to-have-it game. We're not tricking ourselves into thinking Cooper Kupp bombs. That's highly unlikely, but we just know that he can have a 26, 27, 28-point game, and we don't need that. And if that happens, it's hurting other rosters. It's helping us. And so as part of that, we also know that these Cooper Kupp rosters probably don't have the salary for Saquon or McCaffrey, let alone both of them. And we've got Juwan Johnson in here. We're able to get these guys in and fit this in together. So one of the things that I would want to do here is kind of throw in another value piece and get a sense.
Before we move on, could I just ask one more thing about the CMC Barkley? Someone actually asked earlier about playing 2 running backs in the same game. I'm wondering, is this play simply projection based, or is there a slight correlation boost for you because they're playing against each other? Just wanted to know if that was a coincidence or something you were putting a premium on.
The biggest thing here is just that people will have that concern, right? Oh, can I play 2 running backs in the same roster? And people don't want to look stupid. And so people don't want to put it out there if they're not totally sure if it makes sense. So we always want to just think through, well, what are we betting on with McCaffrey? We're just betting on usage. What are we betting on with Saquon? We're just betting on usage. And their usage, we're betting on the fact that they are the focal points of their offense. Hilo did a great job in his NFL Edge write-up this week for this game, basically breaking down how big of an emphasis the Giants placed on Saquon as their centerpiece, as their focal point in week 1 from like a play calling perspective and how he was deployed. So in this instance, we're basically saying both these guys have large pass catching roles. Both of these guys have large per touch upside. Both these guys have touchdown upside. The fact that they're in the same game, it technically doesn't matter that much beyond the fact that it'll make people a little bit more scared to play both of them together. Now, if Saquon has a monster game, does that increase the chances of McCaffrey having a monster game? Not necessarily. Same thing in reverse, but it certainly doesn't hurt, right? And so I wouldn't say that these guys are heavily correlated, but they're also not totally uncorrelated.
Right.
You know, it's just in this very narrow range, but the biggest value here is just that they're both good plays in a vacuum. They'll both carry ownership, but not as many people will put them on a roster together because they just won't know if that's okay to do.
Right. Yeah. And so now, like, if you were to total our cumulative ownership on this roster right now, it would be looking high relative to, I'd say, a lot of lineups I play. But when you factor in the uniqueness of these combos, both within the blocks themselves and then the blocks in conjunction, minus people duping this specific lineup, it theoretically would be a very unique angle.
Right. You've got low ownership on your Rams bet that if the full thing hits, you're in good shape. And so finding those spots where, yeah, ownership's high individually, but what if the bet actually ends up being right? Well, now we still get all the points when other people are getting a portion of the points.
All right, let's go to your, I believe you said a value play wide receiver you were eyeing.
Right. So I want to throw in, because we're probably not going to play the Bengals defense on this roster. I want to gain total leverage off of this. And I want to throw in Noah Brown at 3,800.
Ooh.
And we're basically saying, look, people are going to go cheap at wide receiver. We know that there might be a little bit of Skoranek. There's probably going to be some Dotson. There's going to be plenty of Dortch, we're guessing at this point. But Noah Brown is a guy who very clearly could have similar target level to those guys. He had 9 looks last week. Let's keep in mind that Cooper Rush is not going to light the world on fire this season, but Cooper Rush did, in his one start last year, he produced over 100 yards for Amari Cooper and over 100 yards for CeeDee Lamb. Noah Brown's going to be out there every snap this week as long as Michael Gallup doesn't miraculously make his way onto the field. According to Mike McCarthy, it sounds like Gallup's weeks away. Smart on them to not put him on the PUP list to start the season. Good on you guys, Cowboys. By the way, did you see Mike McCarthy publicly putting blame on Kellen Moore today? Because that's obviously what good leaders, good coaches do.
Oh yeah, they're in the finger pointing
publicly
stage
call out.
right
Yeah,
now.
there we go. So trying to save that job. You know, Sean Payton is lingering off to the side. So the Noah Brown play is a way to say this is a guy who could very easily have 7, 8, 9 targets, and the amount of leverage we gain is unbelievable. In that everybody's betting on the Bengals defense. Everybody's betting on Mixon, and Noah Brown could kind of help this game flow a little bit differently. We don't need the Cowboys to have a huge game. We just need them not to take a bunch of sacks and give the ball away a bunch. If the Cowboys score 16 points and Rush gets sacked twice and they turn the ball over once, who cares, right? The Bengals defense might get whatever that is, 6, 7, 8 points. And we can look for that defense that scores 15 to 20. And we're getting Noah Brown, who's kind of part of the reason why this Bengals defense play isn't hitting. So I've been looking throughout the week for, like, is there a way to leverage the over certainty on the Bengals defense? If you're in large field play, you can go with Rush. You can go with CeeDee Lamb. But in this instance, we're able to take very small risk in terms of salary dedicated to this. And yet, could Noah Brown have 5 catches for 60 yards and a touchdown? That's not crazy. That's not crazy at all. And that's 17 points at 3,800. And so we put ourselves in a good position to get points, to not burn our roster if this doesn't work out, and to get good leverage off of the over certainty everybody's going to have it running at defense with the Bengals.
Yeah. Let's see. I mean, I was taking a peek at defenses. It does obviously look like Bengals are going to be such mega chalk, followed by the Dolphins. I mean, one thing that kind of stands out to me is it looks to me like the 3rd best point per dollar play is another $2,200 defense in the Jets. That's kind of an interesting pivot too. If you go Bengals to Jets, and then on top of it, you're leveraging it with the Noah Brown thing. Any other thoughts on defense specifically for this lineup?
No, what I love about this is we have $10K in salary left over. So we can kind of make a double decision, right? It doesn't, if we say that defense is unpredictable, we don't have to lock ourselves into the Patriots at 2,900 and then say, okay, we have 7,100 left. Who do we want? We can kind of look in this flex range and say, how powerful is it to us to get Debo and one of these cheap defenses? Well, do we really think Debo's the difference maker this week? Or do we want to go down to like Tyreek Hill, and then we have a little bit more salary to play with and we can make our defense decision from there? So yeah, I'm fine kind of picking this, being aware of what we have, and then picking this flex player next, and then seeing what that leaves us with a defense. I actually like Tyreek Hill this week just from a standpoint of usage and ceiling, right? He's we don't know what his floor is, but we're playing tournaments. His ceiling is high enough still to win us a tournament at 7,100. And that leaves us with a nice 2,900 where we're in a range a lot of other people won't pay to. You could say, look, the Steelers aren't going to be as good without TJ Watt, but the Patriots aren't as good without Josh McDaniels right now.
Right.
You could still bet on the Steelers defense at home, or you could bet on the Patriots defense against Mitch Trubisky. Either one of those I'm totally fine with, and kind of separates us from the field a little bit further.
Yeah, I love that. And I do, I see some of your guys' comments in the chat too. The beauty of thinking about things in blocks is if you have player selections that you like better, you can apply this concept with your own builds. It's not, these are obviously not the only players you can do it with. You can find your own Noah Brown, your own Juwan Johnson. Actually, you might not be able to find your own Juwan Johnson, but the point here is to think about how you construct a lineup. And I really like how purposeful you are with every single pick you make and how that informs everything you do. And I assume, like, how much tinkering do you do with seeing how these blocks come together and knowing like, hey, I like these things, but man, these two pairs of blocks, I'm just never going to have this combo based on lineup construction. That one obviously came together fairly nicely because you had thought about it, but I'm curious just how much tinkering it takes you to land on a nice puzzle.
Every week's different, and I mean that in terms of DFS, but also in terms of like my life, right? Like once we're in week 5, my entire work week is NFL. When we're in weeks 1, 2, 3, 4, like this week I had about 20 hours of work, right? That was like site stuff and admin stuff and partnership stuff and team communication stuff. And so on a week like this, it's going to be like a lot of moving parts on Saturday before I find what really clicks. And then, when we get deeper into the season, there's weeks where something just falls in place on a Thursday or Friday. And you're like, well, as long as there's no major news, this is just a super sharp roster. And we don't want, that was the deal with the Herbert and Jacobs and Eckler roster for me last week. Came together on like Wednesday. Well, I don't need to determine whether or not this is the best roster or whether I'm predicting this is going to hit this week. The moment you know it's plus EV, you're good to put it into a tournament. It's going to make you money over time. And like you were saying with the different blocks and different players in these shows every week, right? Don't even think about the players we're talking about because it's not about the players. As long as you're building plus EV rosters, you're going to make money over time. You want sharp players on plus EV rosters, but it's the roster construction that matters so much more than the players. So even if you're like, oh, this guy's a dunce, I don't like these players, or I don't like his reasoning for liking these guys, forget about that, right? Just think about the way we're putting the rosters together and then put the players you like on there, because that's where you make money in DFS. Is you only make money finishing first place in tournaments or really close to first place in tournaments. And you have to build rosters in a particular way in order to do that. So that means making sure that your roster has a path to 200 plus points. And that means making sure that your roster is built in such a way that you actually do have a path to a first place finish. And the more you can think about that and kind of apply these principles, the more money you're going to make over time.
Yep. And you guys be sure to check out the scroll as that content gets populated. I sincerely recommend, even if you just do a 1-week pass, to just go around, scope it out. I know a lot of people checked out the site last week. I haven't gotten any negative feedback about the site. I think everyone who goes and pokes around ends up loving what they see and becomes an integral part of their process and how you think about DFS. So head over to 1 week season. We got links down below. I should also mention, really enjoyed doing my cram on Sunday for the YouTube members. We had a great crew. I record that live at 10:30 a.m. This year. I have made it just for YouTube members. It also, if you want to become members, you get access to that video, and you also get access to a private Discord channel in the Deposit Kingdom. It's our Hand Builders and Opto Bro channel. Lots of good discussion in there. I see a lot of questions in the chat. These are the kind of questions that everyone bats around in the Discord as well. And you can have other smart people vetting your ideas, helping sharpening your lineup building skills. So definitely recommend those things. JM, anything else people should keep an eye out for from your end? You're a content machine these days.
Nothing else from my end. This weekend is going to be the scroll. It's going to be, if you're an Inner Circle member, remember to check out the cheat sheet ownership projections, where we have strategy notes on the different players. So it's not just a number, it's also context of how to process that number, or maybe how to play it against something else. Like Last week, one of the things Zandomir highlighted in the cheat sheet ownership projections was the fact that Kadarius Toney was, beat writers were saying, look, this guy might be the number 4 wideout, and yet he was predicted at 10% ownership. So Zandomir had that note there. And then at the very bottom of the wide receiver ownership projections was Sterling Shepard at 0.8%. And Zandomir said, here's your leverage off of Kadarius Toney right here, right? And it's like, instead of just taking these numbers, saying, okay, what do these numbers mean and how do I use these numbers? So be sure to use those ownership projections if you are an Inner Circle member. Like Pete said, check out the Week Pass. In fact, we've set up something now where you'll get an email shortly before your Week Pass expires that gives you, it gives you 40 off a subscription, but that's actually less off than you'll get using Pete's discount code, 20% off. So use the Week Pass, see if you like it, and then keep that Pete code in mind for 20% off any subscription. That includes OWS for life. So and from there, we're not for everybody. I always say that. Our site's not for everybody, but because of that, the people it's for, it's really for. So check us out. If we're not for you, we're not for you. Keep hanging out with us every week on here. If we are for you, you'll probably really like it. Our renewal rate is ludicrously high every year because, again, the people who like our site, it really is for them. So come hang out with us this week, and we'll see you there. We'll see you back here next week. We'll see you at the top of the leaderboards this weekend, so on and so forth.
Look at you. Yeah, I almost just ended the broadcast right there because
I can do it. I can end a broadcast. I can do it.
Yeah. I will also say the Deposit Kingdom DraftKings Listener League, it did fill as expected during the show. I'll make that one bigger next week, but make sure you're in the Discord. I believe I'm going to be getting that link on Monday nights or Tuesdays, and everyone in the Discord will always get first cracks at that rake-free Listener League. For you audio heads, I do post the audio versions of these podcasts to the In a Vacuum podcast feed. I have that down below if you want to listen back to that, all that good stuff. Also recommend the OWS podcast. I was actually just listening to the Edge one, and I know you're a big 1.5x guy. Put it on that. Get a ton of great information there as well. But
let me jump in on that real quickly because we haven't done a good job highlighting that, and by we I mean me anywhere. But every NFL Edge game is free on the 1 week season podcast feed, so you can get every game broken down top to bottom, audio version completely free. Just search 1 week season on your podcast player.
Yeah. Highly recommend that if you're, I always mix and match, whether it's some stuff I'm consuming audio, sometimes I'm reading. So it's nice to have that optionality. JM and I will be here every Friday at 2 p.m. Last week was just a unique schedule, but we're going to be recording live every Friday, getting you guys ready for the slate, trying to become better players, become better thinkers, and really enjoying this so far and appreciate all of the great feedback. We'll catch you guys in the Discords, on Twitter, and of course at the top of the leaderboards. We'll see you next week. Good luck in week 2.